Ruthless lawyer mocks widow in court. What she reveals next shocks the judge. A silent hush fell over the packed courtroom, an unsettling calm before the storm. Margaret, her grieving eyes, still red, rimmed from the funeral, sat across from the man. Everyone feared Christopher Kane, a ruthless attorney notorious for tearing down anyone in his path. No one had ever stood a chance against Christopher's biting interrogations and ice-cold stratagems. Or so they said. But as the widow took the stand, her trembling voice masked a hidden resolve. Whispers circled the gallery about secrets untold, about the unstoppable force of a mother's love. Little did Christopher realize, this time he'd picked the wrong victim, and the tables were about to turn in ways no one expected. Margaret Parker walked out of Manhattan's Supreme Court, feeling the weight of her world pressing down on her. Just a week had passed since the funeral of her husband, Robert Parker, yet instead of mourning in peace, she found herself entangled in a courtroom battle. The echoes of her husband's final goodbye still haunted her dreams. The guilt of his sudden passing gnawed at her in daylight. She wanted nothing more than to grieve quietly, to remember Robert as the kind, supportive partner who introduced her to everything that made life worth living. But that dream of quiet sorrow crumbled when a neatly typed letter arrived at her doorstep. The stationery was crisp, adorned with the letterhead of a prestigious law firm. Its contents, a summons related to her late husband's estate. She barely had time to process her tears before she discovered that Robert's former business partner, Gerald Stone, was contesting the will. Out of nowhere, Margaret found herself fighting for the home she had lived in for over 2 decades. She never suspected a legal battle. Robert's will, though not extravagantly detailed, had always been clear enough, at least in her eyes. He wanted Margaret to inherit their house, their modest vacation cabin in upstate New York, and keep enough from his life's work to live comfortably. Gerald Stone, however, claimed that the business they had built, an import-export venture dealing in high-end wines, rightfully belonged to him in entirety. The house and cabin, too, he insisted, were acquired through the profits of that venture, and thus should remain with the business. Alone, exhausted, but determined, Margaret stepped into the ring for the first time. She had no idea who would represent Gerald Stone. All she knew was that she couldn't fail, not when Robert's memory and her own future were on the line. Christopher Kane was a name whispered in courthouse corridors with a mix of fear and loathing. He had graduated top of his class from Harvard Law School, and his track record dazzled legal circles, seemingly unbeatable. He specialized in corporate disputes, and his style was often described as ruthless precision. Judges tolerated him for his brilliance, though many privately deplored his arrogance. Opposing counsel either crumbled or pivoted into out-of-court settlements to avoid his venomous cross-examinations. The minute Margaret stepped into the plush, mahogany-paneled offices of Haynes and Donaldson, she sensed the gravity of her situation. She saw Christopher in the flesh, speaking to Gerald Stone in a side office. He was tall, immaculately dressed in an Italian suit, and wore a gleaming Rolex watch around his wrist. Everything about him screamed power and wealth. Rumor had it that Christopher's clients paid him astronomical fees, and he almost always delivered. Margaret's appointed lawyer, an earnest but relatively inexperienced attorney named Daniel Morris, told her one thing on the car ride to the hearing: stay strong. He thrives on intimidation, but the facts are still on our side. Margaret tried to take solace in those words, but she couldn't dispel the tremors in her stomach when Christopher met her eyes for the first time. His gaze was cold, calculating like a predator, studying its next meal. When the time came to gather in front of the judge for the preliminary hearing, Christopher's presence dominated the courtroom. He addressed the judge with clipped respect, fully aware that his reputation could influence the trial's direction. Even in these early moments, he wasted no time painting Margaret as an uninformed, helpless widow who had no right to the assets. Though Margaret had expected hostility, the mocking tone Christopher adopted stung deeper than she anticipated. But she resolved then and there she would not break under his scorn. The day arrived for Margaret to testify regarding the nature of Robert's estate. She recalled stepping onto the stand as if stepping into an arena, her heart pounding like war drums in her ears. Judge Patricia Gomez presided, a seasoned judge known for her fairness and the gentle authority she brought to the courtroom. Yet even her reassuring nod offered little comfort as Christopher Kane rose from his chair. With every question Christopher posed, his voice carried a subtle sarcasm, almost a sneer. He led Margaret through her marriage, highlighting details in a way designed to belittle her involvement in Robert's business. How often did she join Robert on business trips? Did she handle any financial ledgers? Was she aware of licensing agreements? The steady barrage of insinuations made it sound as though Margaret was a clueless spouse, leeching off her husband's success. She answered calmly, though she felt her cheeks flushing. Yes, Robert handled most business matters. Yes, her main role in the enterprise was moral support. No, she didn't spend hours perusing contracts. But that didn't make her ignorant, nor did it nullify her rightful inheritance. She was not the type to shrink under pressure. She recalled how, in the early days, she had saved up every penny to invest in Robert's dream, how they had personally renovated the old property that became the warehouse for storing imported wines. Her voice cracked when she spoke of Robert's final days, how she stayed by his hospital bed, reading him well-worn books and playing his favorite songs, how they whispered about their future, imagining grandchildren filling the home with laughter. She caught Christopher rolling his eyes at her emotional recollections. The sight of his dismissive grin sent a wave of fury through her. She held that rage in check, aware that the bigger her composure, the more his arrogance might someday unravel. When the hearing paused for lunch, Margaret found herself in a cold, grey corner of the courthouse cafeteria, sipping coffee that tasted of burned grounds. Her lawyer, Daniel, slid into the seat across from her, a small stack of papers in hand. "We have something that might help," he said, lowering his voice. Margaret peered at him with weary eyes. "I'm all ears," she replied, glancing over her shoulder as if Christopher Kane might materialize at any second. Daniel explained that he had uncovered a crucial piece of evidence, a letter from Robert to Gerald Stone, written a month before Robert's death. The letter outlined Robert's intentions to restructure the business, with a clause ensuring that Margaret received a regular stipend from the company profits, in addition to whatever real estate assets they had. Though it wasn't legally binding like a will, the letter pointed to Robert's explicit wishes and that Stone had known about them. Hope flickered in Margaret's heart. The letter might not be a silver bullet, but it contradicted Stone's claim that Margaret was unentitled to any business assets. It also revealed that Stone was well aware of Robert's intentions. Daniel believed they could argue Stone had acted in bad faith by denying Margaret the inheritance. Margaret felt an almost tangible weight lift from her shoulders. If only she could shove that letter in Christopher's face and watch his smug smirk vanish. But she knew the legal process was seldom that simple. Documents had to be admitted correctly, arguments carefully framed. Christopher would spare no effort to discredit the letter, calling it a forgery or an irrelevant note that didn't hold up in court. Yet, for the first time since Robert's funeral, Margaret felt a spark of confidence that justice might still be within reach. When court resumed, Daniel formally introduced the letter. Judge Gomez allowed it as an exhibit over Christopher's immediate objections. Seemingly unruffled, Christopher then proceeded with a cross-examination designed to degrade Margaret's credibility. He started with innocuous questions, but soon shifted to insidious insinuations. "Miss S. Parker," he began, voice dripping with condescension, "did you or did you not, at any point, discuss forging your husband's signature on his business checks when he was hospitalized?" The question landed like a punch, sending murmurs through the spectators. Margaret's heart slammed in her chest. She'd done no such thing, yet the mere suggestion was scandalous. Her face burned as she replied, "No, absolutely not. I would never forge anything. Robert taught me better than that." Christopher's cold eyes flicked toward the letter. "Are you sure, Miss S. Parker? Because this so-called letter you claim your husband wrote could just as easily be forged, couldn't it? Your husband was ill. At the time his hand might not have been steady. His mind might not have been sharp." Daniel shot to his feet. "Objection. Sir, counsel is speculating and attacking the authenticity without basis." Judge Gomez gave Christopher a pointed glance. "Sustained. Mr. Kane, keep your questions within reason." Unfazed, Christopher continued, "Isn't it true that your husband's business partner, Mr. Stone, was closer to him in recent years than you were? That Mr. Stone accompanied him on countless business trips while you stayed at home? You had no direct involvement. You relied entirely on second-hand information." Margaret steeled herself. "I trusted my husband. We shared everything, even if I didn't attend every conference." Christopher's grin was razor-sharp. He looked around the room, delivering the final blow. "So you simply expect the court to trust your word? A woman with no business experience, no official role, suddenly brandishing a suspicious letter that surfaces after her husband's death?" He paused. "I say your credibility is highly questionable." Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She knew the worst was yet to come. That evening, after the harrowing session, Margaret broke down in the hallway outside the courtroom. She wasn't sobbing uncontrollably, but tears of frustration spilled from her eyes. She tried wiping them away, determined to keep some composure. Daniel rested a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering quiet solace. Passers-by darted quick, pitying glances, but no one lingered. In the world of high-stakes law, empathy was a luxury seldom afforded. When she finally stepped outside into the crisp Manhattan air, she took a few measured breaths. Her emotions felt raw, her throat tight. She needed something, some sign that she wasn't completely alone in this. Robert was gone. She had few close relatives to lean on. Friends had offered condolences, but were clueless about navigating this labyrinth of legalities. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number lit up her screen. "I'm sorry about what happened in there. For what it's worth, I never meant for things to go this far. Gerald Stone." She stared, astonished. Gerald Stone, who had unleashed Christopher Kane on her, was apologizing. She wanted to smash her phone in anger, but curiosity froze her thumb. She wrote a curt reply. "If you never meant for this to go so far, call off your lawyer." His answer arrived a minute later. "It's complicated. Let's talk, please." She debated, ignoring him. Then she thought about the potential insight Gerald might offer, perhaps a path to settle or clarify Robert's wishes. Did he regret letting Christopher loose to do his worst? She typed back, "Tomorrow, 7 p.m., the cafe near the courthouse." Was Gerald's olive branch genuine, or another trick orchestrated by Christopher? Margaret knew she was desperate, but if there was any hope to avoid more pain in court, she had to seize it, even if it meant dancing with the devil who had started this entire mess. The next evening, Margaret arrived at the tiny cafe with tension coiled in her shoulders. The lingering scent of roasted coffee beans and the soft glow of hanging lamps offered a semblance of comfort. She chose a table in a quiet corner, away from the street's noise. Within minutes, Gerald Stone entered, looking conspicuously uneasy. He wore a plain black coat over a button-down shirt, his typically confident demeanor replaced with the slump of a man burdened by regret. Margaret didn't stand. She watched silently as Gerald approached, uncertain if her anger or sorrow would erupt first. They had once shared dinners with Robert in that very cafe, celebrating business milestones. Now they were adversaries. "Thank you for meeting me," Gerald said, sitting down slowly. She folded her arms. "Make it quick. I'm not in the mood for games." Gerald sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, I didn't know Christopher would be this aggressive. I hired him because of his reputation, but I never intended for him to." His voice faltered. "Margaret, I'm sorry. Robert and I had our disagreements, but he was my partner, my friend. After he died, the investors put pressure on me to secure all assets. I panicked. I thought I could get my fair share without hurting you." Margaret swallowed a bitter laugh. "Well, it's too late for that. Christopher has painted me as a gold-digging, clueless widow. Do you think I deserve this after 2 decades of marriage? I was with Robert until his last breath." Gerald's hands trembled around his coffee cup. "No, you don't deserve it. But these are big stakes. Our business grew more than you know. We have major investors, some with questionable methods. They want absolute control." He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a folded paper. "I found this among Robert's papers in the office. It's another letter. One he wrote to me right after the distribution plan." Margaret's heart thumped. Another letter. She took it, curiosity warring with distrust. If this letter was real, it might change everything, or it could be yet another trap designed by Christopher Kane. Margaret unfolded the letter carefully, aware that the slightest tear might damage its value as evidence. The handwriting looked authentically Robert's, his neat scrawl, the same swirling flourishes at the ends of words. She read in a whisper, "Gerald, the first understand your concerns about our investors, but Margaret's security is non-negotiable. We've worked together for years, but I can't compromise on this. My share should pass to Margaret if anything happens to me. We both know how ruthless some of our partners can be. I want you to protect her when I'm gone. Promise me that you won't let her suffer." Robert Parker tears welled in Margaret's eyes. She could almost hear Robert's voice urging Gerald to protect her. "Why didn't you bring this up before?" she asked, her voice quivering. "It directly contradicts your claim that I have no stake in the business." Gerald looked pained. "Because some of our investors threatened me. They said if I didn't secure full rights, they'd shut down everything, and I'd be left holding massive debts. They claimed Margaret would walk away with it all and leave us bankrupt. I'm ashamed to admit I caved under pressure." She clenched her fists. "Robert was your friend. You could have come to me. We could have found a solution together." He sighed heavily. "I know. But by the time I realized how far Christopher Kane was willing to go, it was too late. Kane told me that if we dragged you through the mud, it would be easier to negotiate a settlement and appease our investors. But it's cruel." Margaret stared at Gerald, her anger warring with pity. If he was telling the truth, he was more of a coward than a villain, weak, manipulated, and easily swayed. Still, none of that erased her suffering. She tucked Robert's second letter into her purse, her mind already spinning with legal strategies. "I'll use this," she said firmly. "You know that, right?" A glimmer of relief flickered in Gerald's eyes. "Yes, and if you need me to testify, I will." Whether or not he would keep that promise under Christopher's intimidation remained to be seen. The next morning, Margaret met with Daniel at his cramped office to show him the second letter. She watched as he scanned the page, his brow furrowing and then lifting in cautious excitement. "This is significant," he said, placing it gently atop the first letter. "We now have two documents strongly indicating Robert's wishes. It's still not a formal codicil," Margaret reminded him. "Christopher will do everything to discredit it." Daniel nodded. "True, but if Gerald corroborates the letter's authenticity, it might sway the judge. It shows intent, which can be persuasive in estate disputes." Margaret inhaled deeply, feeling her nerves prickling. "So, what's our next move?" Daniel's eyes flickered with determination. "We file these as new evidence and request a hearing to re-evaluate the case. Gerald's testimony could be our linchpin." He glanced at Margaret. "But are you sure you can trust him? He's aligned with Christopher, and there's no telling how they'll spin this." "Gerald claims he's remorseful," Margaret said, "but I'm not naive. He's under enormous pressure. We need a backup plan in case he backtracks in court." Daniel frowned. "Agreed. Also, I have a lead on a forensic handwriting expert who can confirm Robert's handwriting, especially if we provide multiple known samples. It won't completely eliminate Christopher's attacks, but it'll strengthen our claim." They spent hours preparing. Margaret produced old birthday cards, signed documents, and even a wedding anniversary love note from Robert to compare with the letters. Each piece was a precious relic of her marriage, but she sacrificed their privacy for the sake of establishing her rightful place in Robert's estate. Soon they had a robust file and a strategy, a motion to admit new evidence, a call for Gerald's testimony, and the potential for expert witnesses. Margaret left the office feeling cautiously optimistic, though she had learned enough about Christopher Kane to know he wouldn't surrender easily. The hardest battles, she suspected, still lay ahead. A few days later, the parties reconvened in Judge Gomez's courtroom. Daniel had already filed the motion to include the newly discovered letter. Christopher, as expected, roared objections, claiming the document was fabricated and that the alleged second letter mysteriously emerged at a suspiciously convenient time. His words dripped with sarcasm as he pointed out how the letter contradicted everything Gerald had claimed before. He demanded that the court recognize a pattern of deceit. Judge Gomez narrowed her eyes at Christopher. "Mr. Kane, your hostility is noted. The matter at hand is whether this new document merits consideration. Miss Parker's counsel has provided preliminary evidence that the letter is authentic. If Mr. Stone can corroborate it, we may move to a handwriting analysis. This court is obliged to consider relevant evidence, regardless of your personal views." Christopher's lips curled into a faint sneer, but he reined in his fury. "Understood, Your Honor." Gerald Stone then took the stand, visibly uneasy. Christopher shot him a menacing glare. Margaret watched tensely, uncertain if Gerald would maintain the truth or crumble under pressure. After placing his hand on the Bible and taking the oath, Gerald coughed nervously, casting a fleeting glance at Margaret. "I confirm," Gerald began, "that the letter Miss Parker introduced was written by Robert Parker and addressed to me. He was concerned about investors. He wanted me to ensure his wife was cared for should anything happen to him." The gallery murmured in surprise. Christopher's jaw tightened. Judge Gomez raised a hand for silence. "So it's your testimony that you received this letter directly from Mr. Parker?" "Yes, Your Honor," Gerald answered, sweat beading on his forehead. "I kept it in my office. 1. I initially withheld it because I felt pressured by the investors to cut Margaret out." Margaret observed Christopher's face. His expression remained impassive, but his knuckles were white around the file he clutched. She realized, at that moment, how formidable an enemy he was. For him, a sworn testimony was just one piece in a strategic chess game. and the next move she feared could be devastating. As the hearing paused for a short recess, Christopher Kane suddenly approached Margaret in the courthouse corridor. His footsteps echoed ominously on the polished floor, and Margaret's instincts screamed caution. She was alone. Daniel had stepped away to make a phone call. With surprising gentleness, Christopher addressed her. "Miss S. Parker, I do hope you realize that no matter how many letters you produce, the law sides with official documents. A will is a will." Margaret bristled. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Kane?" "Threatening?" He forced a laugh that lacked any real mirth. "I'm simply stating facts. Unless you want to end up losing even more time, money, your peace of mind, I suggest you consider an out-of-court settlement." She let the silence hang for a moment. "A settlement that leaves me with what, exactly? Scraps?" Christopher's eyes shone coldly. "Scraps are better than nothing, Miss S. Parker." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Before you get any ideas that you'll cruise to victory with these newly found letters, think again. I have more than one trump card to play." Margaret's heart thudded, but she refused to show fear. "You can try all you like, Mr. Kane. I'm not scared of you." His demeanor remained uncannily calm. "I admire your conviction, truly. But Robert Parker wasn't the man you thought he was. There are records, financial dealings he hid even from Gerald. When I make them public, your credibility might not be the only thing that goes up in flames. Your husband's reputation could crumble." Margaret's throat tightened. She recalled Robert's unwavering honesty, or so she believed. Could Christopher be bluffing? Or did Robert actually keep secrets, even from her? She summoned the last shred of her composure. "I refuse to let you tarnish Robert's memory without proof. If you have something, present it in court." Christopher gave her a thin smile and walked away, leaving Margaret trembling. Her mind whirled with questions. Had Robert hidden something so dark that Christopher could twist it to his advantage? And if so, how far would the ruthless lawyer go to exploit it? After that unsettling encounter, Margaret was plagued by doubts. What if Christopher had stumbled upon something legitimate, some financial misstep, an undisclosed deal? Determined to leave no stone unturned, she confronted Daniel, who looked equally troubled when she relayed Christopher's threat. "Robert was never shady about money," she insisted. "We had an open relationship about our finances, or so I thought. But in business, who knows what might have happened?" Daniel scratched his chin. "Well, we need to investigate any major financial transactions or questionable partnerships. If Christopher has some smoking gun, we should uncover it before he wields it in court." They pored over bank statements, credit card bills, and business ledgers, thousands of documents, each telling a fragment of the story. Days passed in a blur of reading and cross-referencing. Daniel pulled in an accountant friend to help interpret the complexities. Margaret's eyes burned with fatigue, and her heart wavered between hope and dread. Eventually, they found a trail, a series of large, intermittent payments into a foreign bank account in Switzerland. The transaction started about 2 years before Robert's passing and totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. Each deposit was labeled vaguely some variation of consultancy fee. A quake of anxiety rippled through Margaret. She'd had no idea Robert maintained a Swiss account. Could these funds be illegal, or at least suspicious enough for Christopher to use as evidence of wrongdoing? The deeper they dug, the murkier things became. The Swiss account was tied to an offshore holding company with a name Margaret had never heard of, Velnor Associates. Daniel suspected it might be a shell corporation. They needed more context. Was Robert stashing away money or simply diversifying assets legally? Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, thoughts racing. If Christopher discovered these payments, he could claim Robert was laundering funds or cheating the business. The damage to Robert's reputation and, by extension, Margaret's credibility could be irreversible. She had to prepare for the worst while still clinging to the hope that Robert had a valid reason for these transactions. As the next hearing loomed, Margaret's anxiety grew. She could almost sense Christopher plotting the unveiling of Robert's mysterious Swiss transactions. Meanwhile, Gerald's stance seemed to solidify. He was prepared to testify that Robert wanted Margaret to inherit his share. But Gerald, too, grew anxious upon hearing rumors of Christopher's next move. "You should know something," Gerald admitted quietly during a break. They stood together in a small vestibule near the judge's chambers, away from prying ears. "Robert confided in me about those Swiss transactions." Margaret's eyes widened. "He told you? Then why haven't you said anything?" "Because it's complicated. Robert was trying to shield you from it. Some of our investors were borderline criminals, money laundering, ties to organized networks. Robert worried about their intimidation tactics. He stashed money offshore as a safety net in case they ever turned on him. He planned to pull out of the business quietly and protect you if things went sour. I never knew he'd pass away so soon." Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek. "So these transactions were to guard us, not to cheat the company?" Gerald nodded. "Yes. He was terrified that if you knew, you'd be in danger. He thought the less you knew, the safer you'd be. That's why he never told you. But Christopher sees only the big numbers and smells blood. He'll argue it was fraud, or that Robert was siphoning company funds illegally." Margaret exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging. So Robert's secret had been a desperate measure to protect their future. Yet in Christopher's hands, it could be twisted into damning evidence. "We have to make the judge understand the real story," she said. "Let's get ahead of this before Christopher spins it." Gerald nodded, though a shadow of doubt crossed his face. Margaret, Christopher's cunning. Prepare for anything. Steeling herself, Margaret walked into the courtroom, bracing for the storm to come. That afternoon, as expected, Christopher Kane introduced his shocking revelation to the court, documented records of Robert's Swiss account and the large, unexplained transactions. He wore a victorious smirk, holding up a binder thick with financial statements. "Your Honor," he began, "it appears Mr. Parker was diverting substantial company funds to an offshore account. This entire facade of Miss S. Parker's innocence is undermined by the fact that her husband may have been engaged in secret financial dealings." Margaret's heart hammered. She felt every gaze in the courtroom pivot toward her like spotlights. Daniel stood to respond. "The defense will argue these funds were allocated for legitimate reasons, not theft." Christopher scoffed. "Legitimate reasons? Hiding money in Swiss accounts? If that doesn't raise red flags, I don't know what does." Judge Gomez looked unsettled. "Does the defense have any documentation to prove Mr. Parker wasn't simply embezzling from the company?" Daniel inhaled, glancing at Margaret, then at Gerald. "We have testimony from Mr. Stone, who can explain the context." He gestured to Gerald, who took the stand yet again. Christopher circled like a hawk. "Mr. Stone, do enlighten us. Why would your business partner funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars into a Swiss account under a shell corporation, if not for personal gain?" Gerald's voice wavered, but he steadied himself. Robert was concerned about certain investors strong-arming us. He believed we were dealing with people who had criminal ties. He set aside funds to protect his family and eventually exit the business safely. The gallery rustled with murmurs. Christopher pounced. "So he took company money to create a personal safety net, correct? Is that not the definition of embezzlement?" Gerald shook his head. He intended to return the funds once we were clear of dangerous partners. Christopher turned to the judge with a mock, concerned expression. Your Honor, the Parker estate is built on stolen money, and now the widow wants the assets gained from that. One can only imagine how far she'd go to cover it up. Margaret's face burned at the insinuation. She prayed Judge Gomez would see through Christopher's theatrics, but doubt clung to every corner of her mind. Outside the courtroom, the air crackled with tension. Margaret leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing as Daniel conferred with the accountant who'd assisted them. The swirl of allegations, embezzlement, shady investors, offshore accounts had cast a dark shadow over the inheritance question. Even so, Margaret refused to give up. There had to be a way to separate Robert's moral intentions from the unsavory corners he'd been forced into. Daniel returned, his brow knitted. Our accountant says the money in Switzerland can be traced to specific consulting fees that the company technically owed Robert for expansions he managed alone. This might reduce the appearance of theft. Margaret nodded, her throat tight. But Christopher is going to spin it, no matter what. He's too good at this. Let him spin, Daniel said with forced confidence. We just need the truth. If we can prove Robert had the right to that money because he was never fully compensated for his personal contributions, then it's not theft. It's owed wages. Though unorthodox, it wasn't strictly illegal. Gerald stood nearby, arms folded. I'll back that. Robert often used personal funds to salvage deals. Investors seldom acknowledged his extra contributions, so he found a workaround. Margaret mustered a faint smile of gratitude. Thank you, she said, the words feeling inadequate for the weight of her emotions. Gerald's support was crucial, though part of her still resented his earlier betrayal. By the time they reconvened in the courtroom, Margaret's nerves felt raw. But she straightened her back and stepped forward to testify about Robert's unwavering love for moral conduct and how he loathed unethical dealings. She painted a picture of a man cornered by dangerous investors, forced to protect his family in secrecy. Christopher hurled barbed questions, trying to trip her up or reveal contradictions. Yet Margaret held steady, drawing on every ounce of courage left in her. She would not let Christopher tarnish Robert's memory without a fight. As the trial wore on, the weight of stress took a toll on Margaret's health. She found herself awake each night, replaying every second of the hearings in her mind. Insomnia gnawed at her, making her slow to react in court. She started losing weight, dark circles haunting her eyes. Still, she pressed forward. One afternoon, as she trudged through the courthouse hallway, she stumbled, her knees buckling. Immediately, a hand grabbed her arm, steadying her. She looked up, dazed, into the face of Christopher Kane. The man who had tormented her so cruelly seemed momentarily concerned, if only out of reflex. You should be more careful, Miss S. Parker, he said quietly, his usual sneer absent. She stared at him, speechless, before Daniel arrived to support her. Christopher released her arm, letting Daniel take over. Margaret felt something akin to pity well in her chest. Here was the man who had caused her so much anguish, and for just a second, his human side flickered through. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He offered no apology, no genuine kindness, just that single moment when his grip prevented her from hitting the floor. Later, as Margaret sipped water on a courthouse bench, Daniel said, "Even Christopher Kane has some shred of humanity, it appears." She forced a wan smile. Or it's just reflex. There was a witness. Letting me collapse might look bad for him. Daniel shrugged. Perhaps. But you need to look after yourself, Margaret. We're nearly at the final arguments. You can't give in now. She patted Daniel's hand. I won't. Robert didn't raise a quitter. We'll see this through. Yet her thoughts kept straying back to that fleeting softness in Christopher's eyes. It proved that beneath the armor of ruthless ambition, a human heart still beat. and perhaps that meant he could be vulnerable to defeat. At last, the day arrived for closing statements. The courtroom bustled with anticipation, reporters whispering about the sensational claims of embezzlement and a battered widow's fight for her rightful inheritance. Judge Gomez took her seat, looking down at the legal teams with a composed but attentive gaze. Daniel went first, his voice steady but impassioned. He spoke of Robert Parker's dedication to his business and his family, referencing the 2 letters that demonstrated Robert's clear intentions for Margaret to inherit. He acknowledged the offshore account but painted it as a defensive measure against unscrupulous investors, not a criminal endeavor. His words emphasized trust, loyalty, and the moral duty of the court to honor a man's final wishes. Christopher stood next, exuding confidence. With impeccable clarity, he dismissed the letters as sentimental scraps, lacking formal legal weight. He argued that the Swiss account was proof of systematic deceit. According to him, Margaret's entire case rested on forgivable ignorance at best, or at worst, complicity in Robert's alleged embezzlement. He referenced corporate law precedents that overshadowed personal letters and conjured images of unsuspecting shareholders robbed by a cunning scheme. Margaret's chest tightened as Christopher concluded, "The law is unwavering. Sentimentality cannot overshadow contractual and corporate obligations." While we sympathize with Miss S. Parker's emotional plight, she cannot claim that which was unlawfully appropriated. Judge Gomez folded her hands. "Thank you, counsel. I've heard enough. I'll review the evidence and testimonies and issue my decision promptly." A somber hush fell. The judge stood, ending the proceedings. For Margaret, the next hours felt like a purgatory of anxiety. She retreated to the corridor, where Daniel and Gerald tried to console her, but words felt hollow in the face of impending doom. All she could do was wait for the judge's pronouncement, her future, and Robert's legacy hanging in a precarious balance. The courtroom was packed the following morning, anticipation thick in the air. Judge Gomez took the bench, her expression impartial. Margaret's heart pounded, her hands clammy. She locked eyes with Christopher, whose calm demeanor resembled that of a man already celebrating victory. Next to him, Gerald stood tense, uncertain whether his testimony had been enough. Judge Gomez cleared her throat. Having reviewed the evidence, including the contested letters, the Swiss account transactions, and the testimonies of Miss S. Parker, Mr. Stone, and the expert witness, this court finds as follows. While Mr. Parker's actions with the offshore account raise questions, there is insufficient proof to label them as unlawful embezzlement. Mr. Stone's testimony suggests a legitimate, albeit secretive, motive tied to personal safety. Therefore, the funds are not proven to be stolen company assets. She paused, letting the tension mount. Regarding Miss S. Parker's claim to the estate, the deceased left a formal will naming her as his sole beneficiary for personal properties, including the marital home and other assets not explicitly part of the business. The 2 letters, supported by Mr. Stone's corroboration, indicate Robert Parker intended to ensure ongoing financial support for his wife. While not legally binding in the strictest sense, they offer compelling evidence of his wishes in the context of estate distribution. Margaret's breath caught. Could it be good news? Judge Gomez offered a thin but firm smile. I thus rule that Miss S. Parker retains ownership of the marital home and associated properties, as well as entitlement to a portion of the business revenue comparable to her husband's share. The business, however, remains under Mr. Stone's management, subject to fair compensation for Miss S. Parker. Christopher's face remained frozen, disbelief flickering beneath the surface. Applause erupted in the gallery. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, relief washing over her like a tidal wave. Her knees threatened to give way, but Daniel steadied her. Justice, it seemed, had prevailed at least in part. Yet the final chapter of retribution for Christopher Kane was still to be written. After Judge Gomez delivered the verdict, Christopher Kane's smug facade fractured. He rose immediately, volleying protests about gross misinterpretation of corporate law and setting a dangerous precedent. But the judge's gavel struck with finality. She refused to entertain his outburst. Margaret watched Christopher gather his papers in angry, jerky motions. He exited the courtroom like a wounded animal, ignoring reporters clamoring for his statement. Gerald and Daniel both exhaled, exchanging glances of relief. Outside, a swirl of media awaited. Margaret attempted to avoid them, but word had spread of the widow's unlikely victory against a fearsome corporate litigator. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. A sea of questions assaulted her. Miss S. Parker, how do you feel right now? Did you know about your husband's offshore accounts? What's next for you? She offered a polite but subdued response. I'm just thankful the court honored my husband's wishes. Then she hurried away, hoping for peace at last. But fate had more in store for Christopher Kane. Later that evening, a bombshell news story broke on local television. Christopher was under investigation by the State Bar for ethical misconduct in a different high-profile case. According to sources, he had allegedly fabricated evidence in a securities lawsuit. The timing seemed almost poetic. With fresh eyes on him from Margaret's case, no one gave him the benefit of the doubt anymore. Over the next few days, revelations piled up. Former clients came forward, claiming Christopher bullied them into settlements that favored his own pocket. Rumors swirled of perjury, intimidation of witnesses, and misuse of client funds. The pinnacle of his career started to crumble under the weight of collective scrutiny. Margaret heard the news secondhand. A flicker of sympathy stirred within her, but it was overshadowed by a sense of cosmic justice. Christopher Kane, the terror of the courtroom, was finally facing a reckoning of his own making. 3 months later, life looked drastically different for Margaret Parker. She was secure in her home, officially recognized as hers by the courts, and had worked out a settlement with Gerald Stone that provided her a modest but steady income from the business. She was still coming to terms with Robert's secrets, but she felt closer to understanding the sacrifices he made to protect her. Gerald proved true to his promise. He reorganized the company to distance it from unsavory investors, honoring Robert's desire for a more ethical operation. Their professional relationship remained cordial, if not warm. Neither forgot the pain inflicted, but each respected the other's resolve to move forward. As for Christopher Kane, his life had spiraled. The Bar Association suspended him pending further investigation. Multiple lawsuits threatened his finances, and rumors suggested his prized assets, like his flashy sports car and luxurious apartment, might be sold off to pay legal fees. His name, once synonymous with unassailable legal might, had become a cautionary tale of hubris run amok. Margaret often reflected on that final moment in court when she saw Christopher's composure crack. She recognized that, in many ways, the world had shaped him into the ruthless figure he'd become. He had built his career on crushing others, only to be crushed in return by his own misdeeds. Strange as it seemed, Margaret harbored a pinch of pity, but she never forgot how he belittled her grief or tried to destroy Robert's memory. On an early spring morning, with the sun streaming through the windows of her living room, Margaret placed a fresh bouquet of lilies near Robert's portrait. "We did it," she whispered, her voice catching. She closed her eyes, recalling his laughter, his unwavering devotion, the nights they spent dreaming of a safe future. In that quiet moment, she felt his presence, and with it, the firm conviction that new beginnings were indeed possible. Thank you so much for joining me on this emotional journey of betrayal, perseverance, and ultimate justice. Margaret Parker's battle in the courtroom wasn't just about property or finances. It was a testament to the power of loyalty, love, and unwavering resolve. Watching her stand up to a lawyer as ruthless as Christopher Kane and ultimately witness his downfall reminds us that no matter how dark things get, truth and integrity can still prevail. If you found inspiration in Margaret's story and felt that rush of relief when the judge delivered her verdict, please hit that like button. And if you want more dramatic, true-to-life stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Share this video with anyone who appreciates a gripping tale where good ultimately triumphs over greed. Your support means everything. Thank you.